Your Majesty, might I eat what you leave behind? The trembling voice sliced through the crystalline murmur of Buckingham Palace's royal banquet hall like a blade through silk. Your Majesty, might I eat what you leave behind? The words echoed again, impossible yet real, spoken by a creature that seemed to have materialized from London's darkest nightmares. It was November 1851, and the grand winter banquet was at its zenith. Chandeliers dripped with light that danced across 1,000 jewels adorning aristocratic throats. French champagne sparkled in crystal flutes. Royal porcelain plates held the remnants of goose in cherry sauce, their edges traced in gold leaf. The air itself seemed heavy with privilege, thick with the perfume of imported roses, the musk of expensive cigars, the subtle scent of power that clings to those born into it. Beneath these cascading lights, between mahogany tables draped in burgundy velvet, stood Charlotte, 9 years old. Her dress was less a garment than a collection of rags sewn together with desperation. Mud from the Thames caked into the frayed hem, tears patched with fabric that didn't match. Her hair hung in tangled ropes, unwashed for weeks. But it was her eyes that truly marked her as an intruder in this temple of wealth. Those enormous green eyes held oceans, oceans of hunger that gnawed at her bones, oceans of abandonment that had taught her to expect nothing but cruelty from the world. To Lord Pemberton, adjusting his diamond cufflinks, she was an abomination. To the Duchess of Somerset, fanning herself with painted silk, she was a disease that might contaminate the very air. To Baron Hartwell, his belly full of 5 courses, she was entertainment, a grotesque curiosity that had wandered onto the stage of their privilege. Your Majesty, might I eat what you leave behind? The third repetition of those words hung in the perfumed air like a judgment. Have you ever witnessed the moment when an entire room holds its breath? When 300 hearts pause between beats, waiting to see if the world will crack open or seal itself shut again? Lord Reginald Ashworth, that was the man who embodied everything Charlotte's question threatened. Tall as an oak and twice as rigid, he stood at the head of the main table in a crimson velvet coat adorned with medals he'd purchased rather than earned. His face was flushed with the particular red that comes from too much port and too little compassion. A gold signet ring on his finger caught the light as he gestured dismissively. Around him clustered his admirers, Lady Whitmore with her nervous laugh, Sir Edmund with his perpetual sneer, the Chamberlain who nodded at everything Lord Ashworth said as if his neck were spring-loaded. Guards! Lord Ashworth's voice boomed across the hall. Remove this vermin before it contaminates our celebration. His words were meant to sound authoritative, but they carried the petulance of a man whose comfort had been disturbed. In all my years attending the Queen's banquets, I have never witnessed such insolence. The poor should know their place, in the gutters where they belong, not defiling the marble floors of royalty. His cronies erupted in agreement. Hear, hear! Scandalous! The audacity! Their voices created a symphony of disdain, each note adding to the weight pressing down on Charlotte's small shoulders. If this story has already moved you in these first moments, tell us in the comments what city you're watching from, and leave your like to keep bringing stories that touch the heart. But at the elevated table, draped in midnight velvet trimmed with silver thread, sat a figure who had remained silent throughout this spectacle, Queen Victoria Margaret of Windsor. For 3 years, she had worn nothing but black. For 3 years, since fever had stolen both her beloved Prince Albert and their young daughter Eleanor in the same cruel week, she had moved through the palace like a ghost, haunting her own life. Her grey hair, once auburn, was pulled back severely. Her hands, encased in black lace gloves, rested motionless on the table. The only colour about her was the single ruby brooch at her throat, Eleanor's favourite. When Charlotte's voice cut through the banquet hall, something shifted in Victoria's stillness. It was as if a voice from beyond the grave had called her name. For 3 years, she had heard nothing but the silence of loss. For 3 years, she had felt nothing but the weight of absence. But that small, trembling voice asking for scraps at her table, where waste flowed like wine, it pierced through the armor of her grief like nothing had in 1,000 days. The royal guards advanced, their boots clicking on marble, hands reaching for the child who had dared to invade their sacred space. Perhaps you felt invisible too. Perhaps you've stood somewhere you were told you didn't belong, waiting for the hands that would remove you. Stop. One word, a single word from the Queen of England, and 300 people froze. The guards halted mid-stride. The whispered insults died on aristocratic tongues. Even Lord Ashworth's face, contorted in righteous indignation, went slack with disbelief. What happened next would be spoken of in whispers for generations. Victoria Margaret of Windsor, Queen of the British Empire, Empress of territories where the sun never set, descended from her elevated throne. Her black velvet cape whispered across the floor like the wings of some great mournful bird. She walked between the tables, past the Duke of Cornwall, who nearly choked on his wine, past Lady Hastings, who clutched her pearls as if they might protect her from this madness, past the Archbishop himself, who made the sign of the cross. And then, shocking all, defying a millennium of protocol, the Queen of England knelt. She knelt in her morning gown on the marble floor before a filthy child from London's gutters. Charlotte trembled. Her small body shook with the expectation of pain. Every kind person in her short, brutal life had taught her the same lesson. Words lie, but hands tell the truth. She'd been beaten by the matron at the orphanage for crying. She'd been struck by the baker's wife for stealing crusts. She'd learned to flinch at raised voices, to curl into herself at the approach of adults, to expect nothing but the whip or the boot. But when she looked into Victoria's eyes, she found no cruelty there, only a tenderness so profound it hurt to witness. "What is your name, child?" Victoria's voice was soft, meant only for Charlotte's ears, but in the shocked silence of the banquet hall, it carried like a prayer. "Charlotte, your Majesty," the girl whispered, her voice barely more than breath. The Queen's gloved hand, the same hand that had signed laws and commanded armies, reached out slowly, giving Charlotte time to pull away if she wished. When the child didn't flee, Victoria gently took her small, dirt-stained hand in her own. "Then, Charlotte, tonight you shall dine as my guest." The hall erupted. If 300 hearts had stopped before, they now raced with scandal. A queen seating a beggar at the royal table. It was treason against every tradition since William the Conqueror. It was madness. It was impossible. Lord Ashworth's face had gone from port red to apoplectic purple. "Your Majesty, you cannot possibly. This creature is the contamination alone." His words tumbled over each other in their rush to stop what was happening. Victoria rose, bringing Charlotte with her, and fixed Lord Ashworth with a look that had made Parliament itself quake. "I can. I will. And you, Lord Ashworth, will remain silent unless you wish to spend the remainder of this evening in considerably less comfortable quarters." She led Charlotte to the royal table. The child's bare feet left small, muddy prints on the marble. Prints that would be preserved by order of the Queen herself, sealed beneath glass as a reminder of this night. Victoria seated Charlotte in a velvet chair that swallowed her small frame, and personally filled a plate with bread, cheese, roasted chicken, and sugared fruits the child had never imagined existed. Charlotte ate, not with the mannered delicacy of the nobles who watched in horror, but with the desperate hunger of someone who had gone days without food. Her hands trembled. Tears streamed down her dirty cheeks, carving clean paths through the grime. She tried to eat slowly, tried to remember the few manners her mother had taught her before death took her in childbirth, but hunger overruled everything, and Victoria watched. She didn't eat, she didn't drink. She simply watched this small girl devour bread as if it were life itself, and listened as Charlotte's story spilled out between bites, fragments at first, then a flood. "Mama died birthing me," Charlotte whispered, her voice raw. "Never knew her voice, Your Majesty, just the story the midwife told. Said Mama chose me, could have saved herself but chose me." Her small hands clenched around a piece of bread. "Papa tried. God knows he tried. Worked the docks, the factories, anywhere that would have him. But when you're tired and hungry, Your Majesty, your hands slip. You make mistakes. And when Papa's mistake cost the foreman his inventory, they said it was theft." The bread fell to Charlotte's plate. "They hanged him, Your Majesty. I was 7. I watched from the crowd because I needed to say goodbye. Have any of you had to say goodbye too young? Have you watched the world take someone irreplaceable? The orphanage took me after. St. Bartholomew's Home for Wayward Children, they called it. But it weren't a home. The matron, Mrs. Creel, she had hands like hammers and a heart to match. Said orphans were God's punishment for sin. Beat us for crying, beat us for laughing, beat us for being alive and reminding her we existed." Victoria's hand found Charlotte's, squeezed gently. The child looked up, surprised to find tears streaming down the Queen's face. "I ran, Your Majesty. Climbed out a window one night and never looked back. Been living in the tunnels beneath London, in the alleys that smell of rot and death. Sleep next to rats, 'cause at least they don't pretend to care before they hurt you. There are men, Your Majesty, bad men who hunt children in those streets, who promise food and shelter and deliver things." Charlotte's voice broke. "Things I can't speak of. I learned to run fast, to hide in shadows, to become invisible." The entire table had fallen silent. Even Lord Ashworth had no words. Some of the ladies in waiting were openly weeping. "Tonight I was so hungry," Charlotte continued, her voice small again. "Saw the lights of the palace and thought maybe someone would throw away something. Never imagined I'd get inside. Never imagined I'd see so much food that people leave on their plates. Food that could feed a dozen children in the tunnels." She looked up at Victoria with those enormous green eyes. "That's why I asked, Your Majesty, not to shame anyone, just I thought maybe what you didn't want I could." "Your Majesty, you cannot be serious. This is completely improper. The scandal alone." That night, Charlotte was bathed by the ladies in waiting, who wept as they gently washed away layers of grime to reveal skin that was pale and scarred from years of surviving. They dressed her in a nightgown of the softest linen, fabric so fine Charlotte was afraid to touch it. They led her to a bedroom with a canopied bed draped in gold silk, a room larger than the entire orphanage dormitory had been. Charlotte lay in that bed, staring up at the canopy, her clean skin feeling strange against the smooth sheets. The bed was so soft it felt like floating. The room was warm, actually warm, for the first time in years. There was no sound of rats scratching in the walls. No cries of other children having nightmares. No cold that seeped into your bones until you thought you'd never be warm again. And that's when terror set in. Because Charlotte had learned that comfort was always a trap. Kindness was always the bait before the hook. The baker's wife had offered her warm bread once, then locked her in the basement and called the police. The man at the docks had promised her a shilling for sweeping, then tried to sell her to a ship's captain. Every kindness had been a prelude to cruelty. This had to be the same. The Queen, grieving, they said, mad with grief, had taken pity in a moment of weakness. But morning would come. Morning always came. And with morning would come regret, anger at her own generosity, and Charlotte would be punished for the crime of accepting kindness she didn't deserve. Queens don't keep gutter rats. The thought circled Charlotte's mind like a vulture. Queens have real daughters, daughters like the princess who died, the one everyone whispered about. Queens don't keep replacement children picked up from banquet halls. At 3 a.m, Charlotte crept from the bed. She found her old rags. The maids had left them folded on a chair, probably planning to burn them. She dressed quickly, her hands shaking. On the desk she found paper and a pen. Charlotte had learned her letters from a priest who visited the orphanage before Mrs. Greele had driven him away. She wrote slowly, carefully. Charlotte. Dawn broke cold and grey over London. Victoria woke early, as she always did since Eleanor's death. Sleep was thin and troubled, filled with dreams of her daughter's last fevered words. She went immediately to check on Charlotte, carrying a tray of breakfast prepared by the kitchen staff, who had worked through the night to create dishes gentle enough for a malnourished child's stomach. The room was empty. The bed was made with clumsy, unpracticed hands, and on the pillow lay the note. Victoria read it once, twice, 3 times, as if repetition might change the words. Then, very carefully, she set down the breakfast tray and picked up the small bell that would summon her staff. What happened next was unprecedented in the history of the British monarchy. Queen Victoria Margaret of Windsor, ruler of an empire spanning a quarter of the globe, suspended all royal audiences. She recalled Parliament's scheduled sessions. She mobilized the entirety of Scotland Yard. She hired every private investigator in London, and she gave them all a single mission: find Charlotte. But Victoria didn't stop there. Against every protocol, against the advice of every counsellor, she donned a simple brown cloak and hood and went into London herself. Have any of you searched for someone you couldn't bear to lose? Have you felt that desperation that overrides reason? For 5 days and nights, the Queen of England wandered through London's most dangerous districts. Whitechapel, where Jack the Ripper would later hunt. Seven Dials, where murders occurred so frequently the police had stopped investigating them. The Thames Docks, where bodies floated face down and no one asked questions. She carried posters with Charlotte's face sketched from memory, pasting them on walls, pressing them into the hands of beggars and merchants alike. Have you seen this child? Please, if you've seen her, send word to the palace. Parliament whispered that the Queen had gone mad. Newspapers speculated scandal. Was the child actually the Queen's illegitimate daughter? Had grief finally broken Victoria's mind? Lord Ashworth circulated a petition to have her declared unfit to rule. Victoria ignored them all. She searched through rain that turned the streets to rivers of mud. She asked prostitutes and thieves, dock workers and street children. She offered rewards that could feed a family for years. And at night, she returned to the palace only long enough to change into dry clothes before resuming the search at dawn. On the 6th morning, as the first pale light touched the Thames, Victoria found her. Charlotte lay beneath Tower Bridge, tucked into the corner where stone met stone, trying to shelter from the rain that had fallen through the night. Her lips were blue. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Fever burned in her cheeks and glazed her eyes. In her delirium, she was calling out for a mother who would never answer. "Mama! Mama! I'm cold! Mama, please, please come back!" Victoria dropped to her knees, caring nothing for the mud that soaked through her cloak, caring nothing for the curious stares of early morning workers crossing the bridge. She gathered Charlotte into her arms, feeling how light the child was, how fragile, how close to slipping away into the same darkness that had taken Eleanor. "I have you, darling," Victoria whispered, her tears falling onto Charlotte's burning face. "I have you, and I'm not letting go." The royal carriage was summoned. The Empire's best physicians were roused from their beds with orders that carried the full weight of the crown. Save this child, or answer for your failure. Charlotte was installed in a room adjacent to Victoria's own chambers. Compresses were applied to bring down the fever. Medicines were administered. Specialists conferred in urgent whispers, and Victoria never left. For 7 days and 7 nights, the Queen of England maintained a vigil at Charlotte's bedside. She held the child's cold hand in her own. She refused food. "I'll eat when she eats." She refused sleep. "I'll rest when she wakes." She read aloud from books, sang lullabies she'd once sung to Eleanor, and prayed with a fervor she hadn't felt since her daughter's death. "Don't leave me, darling," she whispered into the fevered darkness of the third night. When Charlotte's breathing grew so shallow, the physicians feared the worst. "Please, God, don't take another daughter from me. Haven't I paid enough? Haven't I lost enough? Please, please." On the 8th day, as morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, Charlotte's eyes finally opened. The fever had broken in the early hours of dawn. Her gaze, still weak and unfocused, wandered across the unfamiliar ceiling, the silk bed curtains, the bottles of medicine on the table, and then it found Victoria. The Queen was slumped in a chair, pulled close to the bed, finally asleep from sheer exhaustion. Her grey hair had come loose from its pins and fell around her shoulders. Her morning gown was rumpled. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. But her hand was still wrapped around Charlotte's, fingers intertwined, as if even in sleep she feared the child might disappear again. Charlotte began to cry, not from physical pain, though her body ached and her throat was raw. She cried because suddenly, brutally, she understood. The Queen of England had searched for her, had found her, had stayed with her. Someone wanted her. Someone had fought for her right to exist. The sound of sobbing woke Victoria. Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment she simply stared, as if unable to believe Charlotte was conscious, was crying, was alive. Then tears began streaming down the Queen's face, tears that came from a place beyond words, beyond grief, beyond everything except pure, overwhelming relief. "Charlotte," Victoria's voice broke on the name. "Charlotte, would you stay with me forever? Would you let me be your mother?" The child tried to speak, but sobs choked the words. Finally she managed, "Can I really have a mother again? Can someone like me have a queen as a mother?" Victoria pulled Charlotte into an embrace, careful of her weakness, but unable to contain the need to hold this child, this miracle. "You can. You will. And anyone who tries to stop it will answer to the crown itself." That was the moment that redefined a kingdom. That was the moment when a queen chose love over protocol, when a child chose trust over survival, when two broken hearts began to heal each other. The adoption process that followed was a war. Parliament objected, the church objected, every noble family with an opinion objected. "It sets a dangerous precedent," they argued. "It undermines the social order. It makes a mockery of royal bloodlines." Victoria faced each objection with the same words. "She is my daughter now. Anyone who opposes will answer to the crown." She won. Not quickly and not without cost, but she won. 3 months after Charlotte first asked for scraps at the royal table, the adoption was sealed by royal decree. Charlotte, now Lady Charlotte Victoria Windsor, became a princess of the realm, with all the rights and privileges that entailed. But privileges didn't protect her from cruelty. The noble children who were sent to study alongside her made her life a torment. "The Queen of Rats," they called her, whispering it behind their hands. "The gutter princess. The beggar's child." They mocked her for not knowing which fork to use at dinner. They laughed when she struggled with Latin and French. They sabotaged her assignments and blamed her for the results. The ringleader was Lord Ashworth's son, Edmund, a boy of 12 who had inherited his father's cruelty and his mother's sharp tongue. One afternoon, as Charlotte struggled through a mathematics lesson, Edmund leaned close and whispered loud enough for the entire classroom to hear, "Tell me, does the palace still smell of the Thames mud you brought with you? Or have they finally managed to wash the stench of poverty away?" The other children erupted in laughter. Charlotte's tutor, Mr. Pembroke, made a half-hearted gesture for quiet, but did nothing more. He, like many of the palace staff, resented this disruption to the natural order. Charlotte said nothing. She had learned in the streets that showing pain only encouraged predators. She kept her eyes on her slate, her hand steady as she worked through the problem, even as tears threatened to blur her vision. But someone had been listening. Someone had heard every whispered insult, every cruel laugh. The door to the study hall opened. Every child in the room froze. Queen Victoria stood in the doorway, still in her mourning dress, but with an expression that made even the bravest noble child shrink in their seat. She walked slowly to the front of the room, her footsteps echoing in the sudden, terrified silence. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried more weight than any shout. "Edmund Ashworth, stand!" The boy rose on trembling legs, his face gone pale. "This girl," Victoria said, placing a hand on Charlotte's shoulder, "survived horrors in the streets of London that would break any of you. She has fought rats for food. She has hidden from men who hunt children. She has watched her father hang and slept beside his grave because she had nowhere else to go. She has more courage in her little finger than all your titles combined." Victoria's gaze swept across the room, making eye contact with each child in turn. "Let me be abundantly clear. Charlotte is my daughter. She is a princess of this realm. And if I hear of any of you, showing her anything less than complete respect, you will learn exactly what it means to displease the crown. Your family's positions, your father's titles, your mother's influence, none of it will protect you. Do I make myself understood?" The room erupted in a chorus of, "Yes, Your Majesty," so unified it might have been rehearsed. "Good." Victoria's expression softened as she looked down at Charlotte. "Come, darling, let's take a walk in the gardens. I think we've both had enough of lessons for today." No one ever mocked Charlotte again, but Victoria's transformation wasn't limited to protecting one child. Charlotte's arrival had cracked something open in the Queen's grieving heart, a realization that grief could become something other than a weight to carry. It could become a catalyst. It could drive her to ensure no other child suffered as Charlotte had. Victoria began selling her own possessions, the emerald crown from her coronation, melted down, the gems sold to collectors, 3 royal estates donated to the cause, her private jewel collection auctioned, every pound going toward a single purpose. She founded Charlotte's Home, not an orphanage in the traditional sense, but something entirely new. It was a place that didn't imprison children or force them into servitude. It was a place that educated them, healed them, taught them trades, and gave them dignity. The very first child admitted was a boy from Whitechapel who had lived in the same tunnels where Charlotte had hidden. Within 2 years, Charlotte's Home had expanded to 5 locations across London. Within 5 years, there were facilities in Manchester, Liverpool, and Edinburgh. Thousands of children found refuge, found education, found the chance to become something other than casualties of poverty. And Charlotte was part of it all. As she grew older, educated by the finest tutors and shaped by Victoria's wisdom, she became not just a symbol of the Queen's charity, but an active force for change. At 16, she was teaching reading to children at Charlotte's Home. At 18, she was managing one of the facilities. At 20, she was designing programs to help children transition into trades and apprenticeships. 20 years passed. Victoria's grey hair turned white. The lines on her face deepened, but the darkness that had consumed her after Eleanor's death never fully returned. Charlotte had given her back a purpose, and that purpose had given her back her life. On a November evening in 1871, exactly 20 years after Charlotte first asked her question, Victoria and Charlotte returned to the same banquet hall where it had all begun. But it was transformed. Once a month now, by Victoria's decree, the Royal Banquet Hall opened its doors to London's poor. The hungry were fed, the homeless were clothed, the forgotten were remembered. Victoria, now 72, sat at the same table where she'd once presided over aristocratic gatherings. Charlotte, 29, and radiant in a simple blue gown, sat beside her. Around them sat not nobles, but workers, street cleaners, seamstresses, dock workers. people who had built London with their hands but had never tasted its wealth. The room was warm with conversation and laughter when a small figure appeared at the entrance. A girl of 8, with wild red hair and bare feet, her dress as tattered as Charlotte's had been 2 decades before. She stood in the doorway, her enormous eyes taking in the impossible sight of food and warmth and light. And then, in a trembling voice that carried across the hall and through time itself, she asked. The Queen's eyes shimmered with tears, but her smile was radiant, the smile of someone who had learned that healing others heals yourself, that love multiplies instead of dividing, that redemption is always possible. Charlotte stood and walked to the girl, her movements graceful and confident. She knelt, just as Victoria had knelt before her so many years ago, and took the child's dirty hand in her own clean one. "You won't eat leftovers tonight, my dear," Charlotte said, her voice gentle but firm. "You'll dine with us at the royal table. And tomorrow, if you wish, we'll talk about finding you a home. A real home." The girl began to cry, those same tears Charlotte had shed, tears of disbelief mixed with desperate hope. Victoria watched from her seat, tears streaming freely down her aged face. The circle had closed. The lesson had been passed on. The miracle was multiplying. If this story has touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what moved you most. And if you believe that every person deserves dignity and a second chance, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Your engagement helps us continue bringing stories that remind us of our shared humanity. The story of Victoria and Charlotte Windsor spread across the British Empire and beyond. It was cast in bronze on the doors of Parliament. It was taught in schools for generations. It became more than a tale. It became a living testament to the truth that power without compassion is tyranny, but compassion with power can transform worlds. When Victoria passed away at 80, Charlotte, now Lady Charlotte Victoria Windsor, Duchess of Westminster and Director of the Royal Children's Services, ordered her mother's tombstone in Westminster Abbey to be engraved with words that would outlive them both. "She gave me back my right to exist." And below, the words that would become the motto of every Charlotte's Home facility across the empire. In her lifetime, Charlotte's Homes expanded to 47 locations across 3 continents. Over 100,000 children found refuge, education, and dignity within their walls. Many of these children went on to become teachers, doctors, craftsmen, and even members of Parliament. But more than the numbers, more than the institutions, what endured was the lesson that seeing another person's humanity, truly seeing it, can change everything. That extending your hand to someone society has abandoned doesn't diminish you, it enlarges you. That the question, "Might I eat your leftovers?" can be answered with, "You will dine at my table." And in that answer, a kingdom can be redefined. Today, in every Charlotte's Home facility around the world, above the entrance, hangs a bronze plaque. On it are engraved 2 dates, November 1851 and November 1871, and a simple inscription. Because that's the truth Charlotte and Victoria proved, that belonging isn't determined by birth or wealth or status. Belonging is determined by one person choosing to see another person's worth, to take their hand and to say, "You matter, you deserve dignity, you deserve love." And sometimes all it takes is one person asking for leftovers and another person answering, "Tonight you feast." Perhaps you know someone who feels invisible. Perhaps you felt invisible yourself. Remember this, every person you meet is carrying a story. Every person has inherent worth, and you have the power, the same power Victoria had, to look past the dirt and the rags and the circumstances and see the human being beneath. The question isn't whether you have enough to share. The question is whether you have enough compassion to see someone else's hunger, because once you truly see it, you can never unsee it, And once you act on that seeing, you begin a ripple that never truly ends. That's the legacy of Victoria and Charlotte, not monuments or institutions, though those endure, but the simple revolutionary idea that love extended multiplies infinitely. That one act of compassion can echo through centuries, that asking, "Might I eat your leftovers?" and hearing, "You will dine at my table," can change not just 2 lives, but generations. So the next time you see someone society has rendered invisible, the homeless person on the corner, the child who doesn't quite fit in, the person everyone else ignores, remember Charlotte standing in that banquet hall. Remember Victoria kneeling in the mud. And ask yourself, what would it cost me to see them, to really see them? Because sometimes changing the world is as simple as pulling up a chair and saying, "Sit with me. You belong here too." And that, my friends, is how a question about leftovers became a lesson in love that outlived an empire.